Hello and welcome to this month's VuFind tutorial video, an introduction to ILS drivers. ILS drivers are the connectors between VuFind and backend systems, which allow the VuFind software to provide useful library-related functionality to your users. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what an ILS is, what ILS drivers are available, what they can do and how to set them up, and I'll have some demonstrations along the way. So first of all, to make sure that we're all on the same page here, let's talk about what an ILS actually is. ILS stands for Integrated Library System. This is the software used by most libraries to manage library functions like cataloging and circulation and so forth. In some regions, it may actually be called an LMS or library management system. And in more recent years, a number of products calling themselves library services platforms have come along. But all of these serve the same basic functionality. There are many products in this space, and VuFind is capable of interoperating with many of the available options. As I said, VuFind does this interoperation through pieces of code called ILS drivers, which allow VuFind to connect to a backend system in order to accomplish some things. Those things include retrieval of real-time availability status of items. So the VuFind index contains bibliographic data, but we need to rely on an ILS to get information about item level data, such as, is a book checked out? Is it on the shelf? Where is it located, etc. So VuFind uses an ILS driver to look up this information from your ILS in real time whenever a user wants to know the status of a particular bibliographic record. The ILS driver is also responsible for user authentication. In other words, when the user wants to get information about their account from the ILS, VuFind needs to be able to figure out who they are and whether they're allowed to see that information. And the ILS drivers have built-in authentication functionality to make this happen. If you want, you can also configure VuFind so that the entire VuFind system relies on your ILS for authentication. This is one of several authentication options available in VuFind. The ILS driver is responsible for fetching information about user accounts, things like their current profile, what's their address and phone number, what fines do they have, what transactions like checkouts or holds are currently active. The ILS driver can also handle user requests. So if a user wants to place a hold on a book, renew a book, etc., that can be done in the VuFind interface utilizing the ILS driver in the background. The ILS driver can also retrieve information about course reserves if your library uses that functionality and your ILS supports it. And finally, in some situations, the ILS driver can be used to identify newly added items in your collection, although there are also other ways to do this outside of the ILS driver if you prefer. Many of the ILS drivers bundled with VuFind simply correspond to particular products. So for example, in the open source space, we have drivers for Koha, Evergreen, Folio, and NewGenLib, all of which are open source ILS systems. But there are a few additional ILS drivers that aren't just a straightforward product-based piece of code. These are the sample driver, which is sort of the simplest possible ILS driver code, simply designed to demonstrate sort of a minimum viable product. When you install VuFind, the sample driver is the one that's turned on, though you're not going to want to keep it on because all the sample driver does is tell you that every book is available on the shelf. It has a call number called 1234567, and its location is main library, 3rd floor, which is obviously not true. But again, this was just designed to demonstrate how things fit together, and it is assumed that you will change it when you set up your system. Another special ILS driver is demo. And like the sample driver, the demo driver returns fake information. The difference is that the sample driver is extremely simple and does very little, whereas the demo driver is quite complex and actually simulates all of the ILS functionality that VuFind offers by generating fake data. It also simulates error conditions, so it's useful for testing that the VuFind code is robust enough to handle all kinds of behavior on the part of the ILS. So the demo driver is useful for development and testing, but like sample, you would never want to use this in a production environment. The next two special ILS drivers, though, are options you would consider in a production environment. The first of them is called No ILS, and this is an ILS driver designed for users who don't have an ILS. And it can be configured in two different modes. There's offline mode, which will cause VuFind to display messages indicating that the ILS is currently offline. This is useful if you have an ILS that is down for maintenance. You can even configure VuFind to detect errors in your ILS and switch over to no ILS when something is wrong. So that's useful to allow the VuFind interface to continue to function even if there's a problem with the backend system. The other no ILS mode is called ILS none mode. And you use this if you have no ILS at all and never plan to. And this simply disables all of the ILS related functionality in VuFind while allowing everything else to function. This is what you would want to do if you're, say, using VuFind to create a bibliography or search a website or do something where the ILS is not relevant. There's quite a bit of configuration you can do of the no ILS driver to, for example, pull fields from your MARC records and use them as if they were coming from the ILS. So there's a lot of flexibility here for sort of edge cases where you can't talk directly to your ILS. So if you're in that kind of situation, give this one a look. Finally, the last special ILS driver is called multi-backend. And this is designed for a consortial environment where there are actually records being loaded from multiple libraries, and each library has its own ILS. Multi-backend allows you to set up a separate ILS driver for each library and to proxy requests to the appropriate places so that you can take advantage of all of the ILS functionality across multiple systems. It's quite complex to set up and will be the subject of a future video, but for now, just be aware that it exists in case you should need it. So with this background out of the way, let's do a bit of hands-on work. So I have here my test environment. And I've never configured an ILS driver in any of the past videos. So as I mentioned, VuFind has sample installed by default, and I can prove that by going to the catalog and looking at my book format items. As you can see, when I search for physical books, VuFind uses the ILS driver to try to fetch an availability status, and I'm getting this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 call number, 3rd floor main library. That's what the sample driver provides. And it's just going to tell me that about everything. If I try to use any of the other advanced ILS functionality, it won't work because the sample driver doesn't support any of that. It just gives this one status message. So you may recall from when we installed VuFind originally that there's a web-based install page where you can set some things up, and it does a number of tests that you can fix. And as you can see, my ILS test is failing. It's failing because if you have either of these special testing-oriented drivers installed, either sample or demo, it considers that a failure because they're not real. You wouldn't want to use them in production. So if I click on this fix button, it gives me a drop-down list of all of the currently available ILS drivers with the exception of sample and demo. So I could choose one of these if I happen to have that system. And if I then hit the submit button, what this would do is it would turn on the ILS driver I selected in my config.ini configuration file, which is where you tell VuFind which driver to use. And it would also copy an additional driver-specific INI file into my local configuration directory, because every ILS driver has its own configuration file where you set up how it needs to be connected to by VuFind and what your credentials are and what features to use and so forth. Every ILS has its own settings, so you'll want to read carefully the comments in that ini file to make sure that you set things up correctly. I'm not actually going to use this form here because what I'm going to demonstrate I will do by hand, but I just wanted you to be aware that the web-based installer does help you do the first step of getting the ILS driver set up, but you then have to actually manually configure that ILS-specific INI file, or else nothing is going to work, because all of these require some additional configuration unique to the particular ILS before you'll have full functionality. So I'm just going to switch over to my code editor now so I can show you some configuration files. So as you can see in the main VuFind config VuFind core directory, where all of the default configuration live, you can find all of these ILS specific ini files. Just as a note, you'll see here there are 3 different ILS drivers for Koha, and that's because different versions of Koha support different methods of connection. And of these 3, the Koha REST driver is the newest and the most feature complete. This uses a fairly recently added RESTful API in Koha. So most Koha users should try to use Koha REST, but if you have an older version that doesn't support it, you might use one of these older versions. But just for the sake of example, let's take a quick look at the Koha REST INI file to see what an ILS driver configuration file looks like. You'll see that at the top, we have this catalog section, which has connection credentials. So in this instance, because Koha REST uses a web-based API, we have the URL of the API endpoint. We have some lengthy comments which explain how to set up the RESTful API on the Koha side. And we have some credentials that need to be used to connect to the API. Most of the ILS configurations follow this pattern. They have connection credentials, often to an API, sometimes directly to a database. And then there are some additional settings related to specific features. So for example, in this instance, you can control how hold behavior works. You can control storage retrieval requests. And you can adjust how item statuses are mapped. Again, this is different for each driver, but the important thing is read the comments, see what's available, and configure based on your local needs. So in order to show you some of the ILS functionality that exists, I'm actually going to set up the demo driver today, since as I mentioned, that simulates all of the functionality available to VuFind, and setting it up is actually similar to setting up a real ILS. So first of all, let me go to config.ini and show you that here there's a section called catalog, and the first setting in there is called driver. So you just set this to the name of the driver that you want to use. As you can see, it defaults to sample. I'm going to change it to demo. And that is really all I need to do to turn on the demo driver. But the demo driver won't be fully configured. Before I get on to configuring the rest of the demo driver, though, I wanted to highlight a few other settings here that might be interesting. If you scroll down through the catalog section, you'll see, first of all, there's this load no ILS on failure setting, which defaults to false. But as I mentioned earlier, if you turn this to true, then VuFind will detect any errors that occur when connecting to your ILS and automatically switch to no ILS if something goes wrong, which is useful if, for example, your ILS is offline for a period of time overnight for maintenance or things like that. If you do turn this setting on, you also will want to copy over noils.ini and configure the no ILS driver appropriately. but just be aware that that's something you can do, and it's useful in a lot of situations. There are a lot of settings in here, and I'm not going to cover all of them. You can read the comments to learn more as needed, but some other useful ones are holds mode, which controls where and how VuFind displays links to place holds on books. By default, it is all, which will just display a place hold link next to every item as long as your driver supports holds at all. If you don't want it, you can switch it to disabled, and then users won't be able to place holds. In many cases, though, you're going to want to change the setting to driver. What the driver setting does is ask the ILS driver for each item whether it is available to be put on hold. So if your ILS has complex rules about what is holdable and what is not, the driver setting allows VuFind to delegate to the ILS and follow its rules. Not every ILS driver is set up to support this, but most of the commonly used ones will work correctly in driver mode. There are some settings like whether you allow users to cancel their holds, similar settings for storage retrieval and interlibrary loan requests. You can set up title level holds modes. So the holds mode setting applies to placing holds on specific items. So, if a bib record has 10 items attached to it, there will be a hold link next to each of those 10, and the user can pick a specific one. But in some instances, you want the user to be able to place a title level hold. Just say, give me the first one of these items that's available. In order to turn that on, you just switch on title level holds mode. Again, not every ILS driver supports this, so depending on your situation, you may or may not be able to use it. But if you want it, give it a try, see if it works. If it doesn't, some more work may be needed to improve your ILS driver. But again, for many of the commonly used drivers, the functionality is already there. Scrolling down a little bit more, there are some settings for setting the page size for paginating through lists of checked out items. And then a lot of these settings are for fairly narrow use cases that most people won't need to worry about. The other thing I wanted to mention while we're here in config.ini is authentication related. So as I mentioned before, the ILS drivers take care of authenticating the user with the ILS system so that VuFind knows they're allowed to see, their transactions, their profile, etc. But there are a few details related to this that may be of interest. The first is that, as I mentioned, you can set VuFind to use your ILS driver as the primary authentication method for the whole VuFind system. So as you can see, by default, VuFind uses database authentication, which means that VuFind maintains its own internal database of users. Users can sign up for accounts, and then they log into the accounts they created. But VuFind is also able to delegate authentication to other systems. And if you change this method from database to ILS, it will use your ILS for all logins. So when the user clicks the login button at the top of VuFind, it's going to be using your ILS credentials instead of internal VuFind credentials to log you in. The flip side of this coin is that if you don't want to use the ILS for your primary authentication method, but you also don't want to make the user log in twice, that is, you don't want them to log into their VuFind account and then also have to log into their ILS account with different credentials. In some scenarios, you can avoid that by pre-populating VuFind's database with the credentials for your ILS. Of course, this depends on using an authentication method that provides attributes that can be used to access the ILS. Such authentication methods include, but are not limited to, LDAP and shibboleth. If you're using one of these types of authentication, you'll find that there's a separate section in config.ini for additional authentication settings. Let's just look at the shibboleth one as an example of this. So if I were using the shibboleth authentication provider, I would have this section uncommented, and I'd have some of these settings filled in. But the most important part is down near the bottom of the section. There's this mapping section. And what this does is it maps attributes provided by Shibboleth to columns in VuFind's user table in the database. And as you can see, there are these two at the top, cat username and cat password. These are the credentials that are used to connect to your ILS. So if you have attributes in your authentication system that could be used for logging in, you can map them here, and then the user will have a seamless experience of signing in once to VuFind, and when they try to access ILS-related functionality, they'll just get to it without being prompted to log in further. Obviously, the exact details of how you set this up are going to depend on your authentication system and your ILS. This can vary quite a bit, but just as one example, in some Voyager systems, the credentials to access the ILS are the user's barcode and last name. These tend to be attributes you can get out of your organizational authentication system. So you can map them here, then the user logs in, the login system sends their barcode and last name into VuFind's database, and then when they try to access ILS-specific functionality, VuFind looks up the credentials in the database, sends them to the ILS, and everything works seamlessly. If the credentials are rejected for whatever reason, only then will the user be prompted to actually type those things in. So that's a whole lot of configuration. Let's get past that and actually look at what this stuff looks like when it's working. So as I mentioned earlier, I already set my driver setting to demo up here. But as I said, every ILS driver comes with its own ini file with additional settings, and demo is no exception. So if I go up to the default configuration directory, I'm going to find a demo.ini file here. But as with any other configuration file, I never want to edit the core copy of it. I want to create a local copy and make my configuration changes there. So I am going to copy this file, and I'm going to go down to my local config directory, and I'm going to paste my file in here. So now I have a local copy of demo.ini. Now, the demo driver doesn't really require a whole lot of configuration because everything it does is fake, and it's all simulated, so it really doesn't much matter what it does. But as I mentioned during the earlier part of the presentation, one of the things that the demo driver does is simulate failure. And that's useful for testing how VuFind responds to ILS errors, but it's also kind of annoying if you just want to test the functionality. So there's a section in the configuration here called failure probabilities, which is the percentage chance of something going wrong in various scenarios. So I'm just going to set all these failure probabilities to 0 so that I won't see any errors during my demo. Another thing that I could potentially do if I wanted to is set up some fake users in my simulated ILS. So if I uncommented this user section, I could create username password pairs, and then the ILS driver would enforce I could only log into the ILS using the credentials here. If I leave this commented out, then it doesn't care what I type into the login form. It'll just always let me log in. And I'm going to leave it that way for the purposes of demonstration. So now that the demo driver is all set up, let's switch back over here and go back to my search results, which, as you recall earlier, were showing third floor main library, but let's refresh the page. It's still showing third floor main library. Did I forget to hit save in config.ini? I sure did. So let me save the change to the driver setting. come back over here and refresh the page. And now all of my records are showing different results because this is all being randomly generated by the ILS driver. If I click into the record page, I can see considerably more detailed holdings information. This is all information that comes in real time from the ILS driver. And as you can see, I have the place a hold option, which if I click it is going to require me to log in first. So let's see, I have a fake account here. And now it's prompting me to log into my catalog profile. This is how the ILS driver authenticates. And as I mentioned, I can put anything in here. It doesn't matter because I have the driver configured to accept all credentials. So now I am fully logged in and I can place my hold on test publication 201-700. And if I go to my holds and recalls screen, I can see that the hold that I placed is actually here, because even though the demo driver is completely fake, it does have an internal memory and it really simulates these things working from end to end. You'll notice it's showing that I have some checked out items because it will simulate random checked out items. I have some fines, it simulates those as well, and so on and so forth. So going back to holds and recalls, you may have noticed when I was highlighting the configuration settings for ILS drivers that there's a setting to allow holds to be canceled. As you can see here, that is off by default. I have no cancel option. But let's just demonstrate that I can come back over here, set cancel holds enabled to true, save the file, refresh this page, and now I have cancel controls and I can cancel my hold. There we go. There's a whole lot more that you can do with the ILS. If you follow my footprints here and set up the demo driver, you'll have ample opportunities to play with all of the options. But hopefully this has given you a little taste of what ILS drivers are and what's involved in setting them up. I also wanted to use the last couple minutes of this video to mention a couple of troubleshooting tips, because ILS drivers can be among the more tricky things to set up in VuFind because it involves interoperability between systems. So if you're trying to get an ILS working and you're having trouble, I have a few suggestions. First of all, as I already mentioned, be sure to read the comments in the ILS specific INI file because there may be some hints and tips there that are important. Next, make sure that there's not a firewall or permission issue standing in your way. Obviously, if you're using an API or connecting to a database, this requires your VuFind server to be able to talk to some other server somewhere. And you need to be sure that that server is allowing connections, that there's no intervening network device that's blocking those communications, etc. If you think things are set up, but they're not working in VuFind, try testing them in some other way. For example, if you're trying to connect to a database, use a database client program to connect directly from your VuFind server to the database. That will tell you whether it's a low-level connection problem or something specific to VuFind. Similarly, if you're having trouble connecting to an API, use curl or wget or something like that to try to talk to the API directly from the command line. If that works, then you have a problem in VuFind. If that doesn't work, you know it's a lower level network issue. Finally, if some function is not working correctly in VuFind, you can always try switching to the demo driver. This will simulate the same functionality. And if that doesn't work as expected, you've perhaps found a bug in VuFind. But if it works with the demo driver, but not with your real driver, then you've at least narrowed down the cause of your problem to a specific driver, and you know how to troubleshoot further from there. That's obviously just a nutshell. It can get more complicated. And I certainly encourage you to reach out to the VuFind mailing lists and other community forums for support if you need more help. But anyway, that's all I have for this month. Thank you for listening. I hope this is helpful, and we'll have more soon. Bye for now.